Hello, everybody. Welcome to a new episode of the Dissenter. I'm your host, as always, Ricardo Lopes, and today I'm joined by Dr. Moshe Bar. He is head of the Cognitive Neuroscience Lab at the Multidisciplinary Brain Research Center at Bar-Ilan University in Israel. He does research in cognitive neuroscience, biological psychiatry, neuroimaging, and learning and memory. And today we're going to talk about his book, Mindwandering, How Your Constant Mental Drift Can Improve Your Mood and Boost Your Creativity. So, Dr. Bar, welcome to the show. It's a pleasure to have you on.
Thank you very much. Muy obrigado.
Great. So let's start with a basic definition. What is mind wandering, particularly from a neuroscientific perspective, which is where you come from?
So mind wandering is really taken, it's a matter of definition, as you said, and is taken as a collection of processes. So it's not only one thing. So mind wandering can be thinking about the future and preparing, making plans about the future, your upcoming trip or your upcoming dinner. It could be a simulation of an event that is not likely to happen, like, if the ceiling is going to fall here and how will I evacuate myself and all this. So it's not likely, but we are still engaged in it, and we can talk about it more. It can also involve worrying and thinking about either about the future, like in anxiety, worrying about a certain scenario, or ruminating about the past, like it happens when it's chronic enough, it happens in depression. So when we think about a miserable comment that we made last night over dinner, so we kind of ruminate and we go over and over around this issue. So really, there's good and bad mind wandering. I think part of my mission with the book is really to rid people of the guilt that society has instilled in us about wandering. There's many good things about mind wandering, but we also need to be aware of the less constructive aspects.
Mm-hmm. So, and associated with mind wandering in the book, you talk a lot about the default mode network. So, what is this and what is its relationship to mind wandering?
Right. So, I'll start it as a separate description, as you said, and then we'll make the connection, if you will. Mm-hmm. So, the idea here is that, at the early days of functional imaging, of neuroimaging, like functional MRI that people are familiar with, we used to have participants come to our lab, and we had them engage in blocks of experimental conditions. So let's say that this is an experiment that compares how you respond to happy faces versus sad faces. So you see many happy faces, then there's a little break. We tell the individual, the subject, to rest for a few minutes, and during this time the computer reconstructs pictures and the brain and the models of the brain and the activation, and then we move on to the next block of pictures, let's say of the sad faces. And the assumption, even though it's naive and it wasn't too explicit, the assumption is that when you tell subjects now to rest and not to do anything, and they don't have a task at hand, that their brain is also resting, and that actually almost goes to sleep in terms of the brain being much less active. But after a couple of decades of fMRI research, we started looking at what happens during these rest periods, and really, by a matter of serendipity, people noticed that actually a large part of the brain, a large network of areas of the brain, is vigorously active during rest. So we call it the default mode network, because this is what our brain does by default. But it's pretty shocking to realize, at first at least, what large network it is and how active it is. And two things are noteworthy here. One of them is that it's highly consistent across individuals, across experiments, across environments. We all show this default activity, default mode network that is vigorously active. Second thing is that brain activity requires energy, requires metabolic energy, and such massive amounts of activation requires massive levels of energy. And understanding evolution and how the brain works, we know that there's no way nature would have us expend so much energy on something that doesn't have a purpose. And therefore, we started to search what is the purpose of this vigorous activity. And here comes the connection with mind wandering. We realize that this is really, this network, this default mode network, is the seat, is the platform of mind wandering. And when we wander, when we're stuck in traffic, and when we stop following a lecture and we drift in our thoughts, that we really engage this massive network, the default mode network.
But do people or can people have any sort of conscious control over their thoughts, or is it just that they're having one thought and then the way it gets associated with other thoughts, memories, for example, is completely out of their control?
This is an excellent question. So I like to say that mind wandering has a mind of its own. So we really don't have much of control. It's not an evolutional process. And you usually catch yourself wandering only after you finished. You can't really make yourself stop wandering in the middle consciously. You can't also tell yourself, let's wander now about my upcoming whatever simulation. So there is a large aspect of that is out of our control. That said, I'm talking a lot about the benefits of specific types of mind wandering, and there I do talk about conditions that are conducive of this wandering. So as I spoke about the gift before, so if you know that you're lying in your sofa now and you have good thoughts and you know that they lead you to somewhere interesting, telling yourself, no, I should stop wandering and get busy with something more productive, this is less, I think that we should respect, in a way, our successful and more fruitful wandering and say, okay, you know what, I have a good streak of thoughts, let's just stay in bed and let's see where it leads me to. So while we cannot interfere with the process itself, we can generate the conditions, and the opposite, when you worry too much, when you're anxious too much, you know that this wandering is not so good for you, and then you're able to seek conditions that will take you away, environmental conditions that will take you away from the less desirable wandering.
Do neuroscientists have an understanding of how thoughts, particularly memories, get stored in the brain, and why is it that, for example, some of them tend to go together, one triggers the other, and not so much perhaps other kinds of thoughts? I mean, do we have any idea about that?
Yeah. So again, this is a good question, but also a huge question. It has many aspects. So when you think about a thought in the brain, you can, we do brain research on multiple levels. So some people look at the molecules and the neurotransmitters, and some people look at individual neurons and synaptic connections. Some people think about neuronal structures and circuits. Some people think about anatomy. Some people think about how neurons fire and communicate. And some people like me think about cognitive neuroscience, the high-level aspects of these processes. So in some of these levels, we know more about thinking than others. We are definitely far from giving a good mechanistic explanation of how thoughts arise and what leads from one to another, but we do talk about this leading aspect, what you alluded to in your question, especially the associative aspect. So we know, and we've shown in the lab, that if I tell you table, you're most likely to activate also the thought about a chair, because it's from the statistics of your environment. We call it statistical regularities. The statistics of your environment made you represent them together and connect them together because they're highly associated. When you enter a kitchen, you're very often finding a stove and a refrigerator and a microwave and an espresso machine or whatever. So you store this together, and not only that it makes representations and storage more efficient, it also makes it easier for you to activate predictions. You want to know what to expect. We do like to think about ourselves as open and spontaneous, but the truth is that we are very anxious race, and we do want to minimize uncertainty. We do want to understand what happens out, beyond the corner, so to speak. So to do that, we have to learn from our experience, and we have to extract expectations and predictions based on these stored representations. So the associative aspect of memory is something that's been studied extensively. So this is one aspect that we understand pretty well. But beyond that, we can't really tell much about how one thought leads to the other and where do thoughts arise, especially if you take the subconscious into account, and the origin of some of our trains of thoughts is not really clear to us. I know what I think about now, but what thought has led to it, that's not always something I'm privy to.
So earlier in our conversation, you mentioned that there is good and bad mind wandering, but can
Right.
people also mind wander too much? I mean, when are people going beyond what should be a good level or a good amount of mind wandering?
That's so I'm really not here to give prescriptions in a way,
Sure.
but but findings from the lab of my dear friend Dan Gilbert at Harvard, and afterwards others have followed up, show that on average, people wander for 47, almost 50% of their waking hours, which I think this is outrageous almost. So half of our waking hours, our mind is not where our body is, we just drift. So this is huge amount, but I don't think that I want to say that it's too much or too little. It's just a matter of content. As I said before, if you're thinking creatively and you're generating great ideas, go ahead and wander even for 90% of your time. But if you're busy ruminating and making yourself miserable or worrying about something needless, or you really have to go somewhere, you want to listen to the story of your little daughter that's coming back from school, then it's not good for you. So I think rather than speaking about specific percentages, I would think about context and content. And in some situations you want more, some situations you want less. And that's part of the things I try to accomplish with the book, help people be aware of the different types of wandering and how to distinguish between them so that they can guide themselves to when it's good and when it's less good for them to wander.
Mm-hmm. So, what is broader ranging mind wandering and how is it associated with mental health?
Good. So wandering, as I said before, is a collection of processes. So also that's not only one type of mind wandering, but also, as you say in your question, there's even when you wonder about a specific topic, there's a different nature for this. So beyond the content of mind wandering, there's different nature. So mind wandering can be expansive in the way that it's broader, that you think about one association that leads you to another, to another, to another, and let's say you say Portugal, and then I think about my visit to Porto, and then I think about the port wine, and then I think about sweet alcohol, and then I think that, well, I'm stuck. Maybe I'm ruminating. Usually it's much easier to just jump from one association to the other, and very quickly you find yourself, from thinking about E equals MC square to thinking about the Beatles. Okay, so you can very quickly reach a far destination. So this is broad mind wandering, and it's usually associated, when it's not clinical, it's associated more with creative thinking. Okay, the ruminative mind that's often associated with depression and anxiety and other mood disorders is very narrow. You keep thinking about the same topic over and over, and we even tried in the lab to induce different types of wandering. Making people think broadly, improve their mood, and making people think narrowly, deteriorate their mood. And interestingly, it's a reciprocal connection. People that are very creative and think broadly, so when people are happier or in a better mood, their associations are broader, and when people are in a worse mood, their associations are narrower, their thinking is narrower. So this is reciprocal connection, and now we can actually take it and try to use it as we do now. Now I'm sitting not in the university, but in my company, where we're actually trying to use this method to improve people's mood just by changing the way they think in terms of broad versus narrow.
Mm-hmm. So, how is mind wandering associated with a mental disorder like schizophrenia?
So schizophrenia, we talk about broad and associative mind wandering is a good thing, but everything, as we know, in moderation. We do have an important concept in the brain that's called inhibition, so the opposite of excitation. So you want to activate things, but you also want to prune them. You don't want to get out of hand with your associations. In schizophrenia, they have less of this inhibition. So let's say in depression, they have too much of this inhibition. That's why they think narrowly. People in schizophrenia have less of this association, of this inhibition, and as a result, their associations are loose and sometimes cannot be seen by others. They're only in their mind, and this what results. This hyperassociativity and too broad of thinking may result in delusions and hallucination. So this is more characteristic of schizophrenics, the thought pattern that is too broad and too associative.
Mm-hmm. And since we're talking about associativity, what is the relationship, if any, of course, between associative information and human preferences? Do our preferences stem in any way from the kinds of associations that we establish?
That's a very good question. So we did have one or two studies about this because of this link that I mentioned before, that broader associations elicits better mood. So we showed that people prefer objects, just everyday objects, that elicit more associations and broader associations than objects that were narrower in the associations that they lead to. Okay, so a pizza cutter, right, only activates the association of a pizza. So even though we all love pizza, it's only a single association. It doesn't take you broadly, right? But if you take a picture of a bottle of mineral water, right, this can't be more boring than this object, but then it activates a lot of associations. You can think about the gym, about the beach, being in the car, drinking more, drinking less, and gradually you generate broader and broader thinking. So we thought, and we showed that everyday objects that elicit more and broader associations were liked better, and we think it's because they create better mood.
Mm-hmm. So there's one thing I haven't asked you about yet. What do we usually mind wander about? I mean, what are the usual contents of mind wandering?
So it's very diverse, very individual, and very diverse. But let's list a few of them, and I think everybody can resonate. You can, for example, the easiest example is you're stuck in traffic and you know you're coming back home and you will be preparing dinner, okay? So you actually have you drift, you don't look at your environment as attentively, you don't think about the cars around you, but rather your mind is somewhere else. And it thinks about the elements that are in your fridge and in your pantry and what your body tells you that it would like to eat. And you're going to make a whole script of how you're going to make your dinner. So there's a whole script that afterwards you store and you use it when the moment arrives. But you can think about the future in terms of planning. You can think also about the future in less constructive manner. You think, oh my God, tomorrow I have this job interview and I'm not sure what to wear, or what kind of questions they're going to ask me. Is there any good way to prepare for it? So again, you think about the future. We call it mental time travel because you think about present, but also future and also the past. And in the past, you can just reminisce. You can think about a good compliment that your boss or somebody gave you on the street and kind of bask in it. Or you can, again, regret something that happened or that you've done or a missed opportunity. Or you can travel back and forth and say, okay, next time, I remember this restaurant I went to yesterday and I ordered this dish instead of the other one. It wasn't as good, but my friend took the other dish. So next time I'm going to order this dish. So you see, you're making planning, you're taking memory, you're projecting into the future. And even if it's very mundane and boring example, we do this all the time. And it's important that we be aware of it. So mind wandering is not primarily flying on geese with the princesses and in fantasy land. We are mind wandering about mundane and boring stuff that is important for us because this way we prepare ourselves for the future and we can be better in our experiences.
Mm-hmm. So let's talk about specific aspects of our minds that go associated with mind wandering. What is the relationship between the default mode network and our sense of self?
So you're right. At the moment, now I'm going to continue the chronological survey I did before when I told you about how we discovered the default mode network. So once we realized that this is what's happening, the quest began to say, okay, mind wandering is keeping us busy for about half of our waking hours, and it takes place on this collection of neural structures we call the default mode network. So what does occupy? What is it that occupies the default network and mind wandering? So what we did was to look at different labs. When I say we, I talk about our community. It's not all my research at all. So many people are engaged in it. And we realized that mind wandering is occupied, if you allow me, I'll go beyond your question. I will answer your question, but also go beyond.
Sure.
What occupies mind wandering is maybe three types of big processes. One is about the self, as you asked about. And it's a representation of yourself, predictions about how you might react. So even if you just think, how about I offer you now cheesecake versus chocolate cake, right? So you think about yourself, your representation, the representation of yourself with your history and your preferences, desires, experiences, anticipations, what comes after, what came before. And so we represent ourselves, which is really evolving since childhood. And this occupies the default mode network. Similarly, another interesting aspect is thinking about others. And I'm not talking about thinking about others as in altruistic term, but more in preparation terms, in the survival and interaction. So there is something that we call theory of mind, and theory of mind is thinking about what others are intending. So when somebody tells you something, already at the beginning of their sentence, you try to anticipate the end of it, you try to understand what is the real intention beyond this sentence. Or somebody approaches you with a certain gait, with a certain body language, and you think, they come to hurt me or they come to hug me. So all this kind of understanding, getting into somebody else's mind and understanding their intention is critical for us. We are not as good at it as we think we are, but nevertheless, we keep attempting because there's nothing else we can do. The third aspect is what I mentioned before, is the generation and activation of associations, running all these predictions and simulations so we can be ready for future scenarios.
Mm-hmm. When it comes to our inner speech, I mean, what do we need it for? What functions does it serve?
So inner speech is really something that people study, and it's somewhat mysterious still. Obviously, we have both inner monologue and inner dialogue, right? Sometimes it's as if we have two people talking inside our mind. And it serves, according to the theories, it serves a few functions. One of them is that it verbalizes your thoughts. We don't know how thoughts, it also connects to one of your earlier questions, we don't really know how thoughts are represented in the brain. And maybe thoughts are like symbols that are exchanged, but in order to make them communicable, so we can tell them about to others and also to ourselves, we need to translate them to words. So this thing that sounds like speech, inner speech, is actually us translating ourselves, our thoughts from symbols or from other mysterious language to a language that we and others can understand. It's also, of course, priming our speech areas in the brain and comprehension areas in the brain. And it's also part of the simulations I described before. You think about an upcoming conversation, let's say a hard discussion you need to do with somebody, you kind of rehearse it in your mind and you speak it as by way of preparing and rehearsing.
Mm-hmm. So I want to ask you about a particular experiment you yourself did and you describe in the book. that has to do with your work on visual cognition. Tell us about the drill versus hairdryer experiment.
Yes, so we believe that, we've shown this in multiple experiments, and by now others have shown this. Just asking that they'll make it less hot, less cold here. Yeah, we talked about. Yes. So we believe that this type of predictions, the idea here is that we want to be ready as quickly as possible. You know, you want to know if something is a snake on the floor or just a garden hose as quickly as possible. So to do this, our brain relies on the general shape. We call this low spatial frequencies. It's really you can think about it as the global shape. So you don't see the texture, you don't see, but you get the global properties. And we found that indeed this is powerful enough to generate initial predictions about what this object might be. So it's interesting that when you have to recognize an object, you really have to tell yourself or others, what is this object out of tens of thousands of objects that we're familiar with? So initially, you can think about it, we call it search space. You have to search in your space of possible objects, this single object, you go across all of them. So by a blurred object, giving you these early low spatial frequencies, you generate a quick prediction that really minimizes the search space to just a handful of examples. So in the lab, like we took a blurred drill, okay, and we show that it can be seen either as, if you force people to recognize this blurred cloud, and people can see examples in our publications, they see a blurred cloud and they think it is either a drill, a hairdryer, or a gun. But it's not an elephant, it's not a pen, it's not a basketball, so you eliminate the vast, vast majority of all other possibilities. So by taking this rudimentary, really cursory information, you can already limit the options, and you save your brain a lot of effort for needing to go across everything you know.
Mm-hmm. So another thing, and talking about, we've already talked about mental time traveling. Of course, when we, for example, plan things, when we're going to meet someone new and so on, we usually develop expectations, being them good, bad, or something in between. Are these expectations inevitable? I mean, is it that we always develop them and they're inevitable, and can we do something about them?
Yeah, so it's also a good question. It allows me to enter into a new domain here of things I've covered in the lab and in the book. Mm-hmm. So first of all, I think it's very intuitive, and you don't need to study this to know it, that we generate more predictions and more accurate predictions in domains that we have some knowledge, okay? So if I'm not good in the kitchen, you tell me I put yeast with flour and I add to it some jam and it comes out better. It's like, I have no idea. I cannot predict what would happen, okay? But if you tell me about an experiment you would like to run, I'll be much better at understanding other domains of expertise. So we create more or less predictions that are more or less accurate depending on the domain and your familiarity with this domain. But also, our mind is not fixed. It's dynamic in the sense that we have very different states. We can be in different states in the morning, in the afternoon, with people, with other people, without other people, when we're hungry, when we're restful, when we're in a new city, when we're tourists, when we're afraid coming out of a lab, a bar, into a dark alley. So our state really dictates how we consume our environment and how we anticipate our environment. So if you are entering a kitchen, you cannot stop your mind, and this is indeed inevitable, as you said. You cannot stop your mind from generating predictions. We even generate predictions when we have no knowledge. So I talk with some phone service company representative on the phone, and as he speaks, I imagine how he looks. There's absolutely no basis for this prediction, but nevertheless, we generate it. So we know we're really suckers for certainty. We would like to know as much as possible about the future. But because our mind is different at different times, we looked at these continuums of states. And the same way that in one end of this continuum you can be thinking very broadly, and at the other end of this condition, a dimension, you may be thinking very narrowly. Similarly, you can be more of an explorer, and I'll explain this in a second, versus exploiter. Okay? And to show you how associative the mind is, the moment I said explorer, I thought about this Vasco da Gama, a very nice statue. I think it's in Lisboa, that goes into the water. It's beautiful, and I remember my visit to the top there. So you see that our minds are very associative. So when you're in an exploratory state of mind, when you're an explorer, you're open to uncertainties. You want to learn new things. You want to experience new things. So when I visited India not too long ago, and I went to Varanasi, a city that really I love maybe most than any other city I've seen in my life, because it was so exciting and so stimulating and so different. There, both, I didn't have enough knowledge to generate predictions, but also I didn't want to generate predictions, because the problem is that when we generate predictions, we believe them too much. We tend to rely on them. When you're open-minded, if you can tolerate the uncertainty, then you're open to more things. If you can live with this somewhat of an anxiety or uncertainty, then you actually can benefit more, you can learn more. So you come to a new place, and not only that you don't have enough knowledge to generate predictions, you came there to learn and experience. You don't want to limit yourself only to the scope of your predictions. So by default, you just don't generate predictions. Or, you watch a movie and you try to guess who killed the main character. No, the main character is the one who's maybe looking for it. But anyway, you try to guess the rest of the plot. And then something in your mind tells you, I'm just ruining my fun. Let it come to me, as they say in meditation. And you want to see whether I can just suspend my predictions and kind of let reality unfold in front of my eyes without me filtering and limiting the options. The other extreme of this continuum, we call it openness to experience. So on one hand is exploratory, the other one is exploitatory. This is the other extreme mode where we actually exploit existing knowledge. So you're familiar with the specific environment. You know what you expect. You know if you order this dish, what you're going to receive. You know if you're going to tell somebody who really knows you something about yourself, how they would react, or how they respond to a question from you. So, and sometimes we gravitate. We want to maybe be more efficient in energy, or we want to be safer. So we put learning and experiencing aside, and we put safety and efficiency up front, and there we rely more on our predictions and our existing memories as they stream top down. So different states of mind call to different levels of predictions and different reliance on predictions.
Mm-hmm. And talking about predictions, how fast do people form first impressions of others, and are these updatable? I mean, to what extent can people update them?
Yeah, so it's we've shown in the lab that people can generate first impressions as quickly as 39 milliseconds. So 39 thousandths of a second, I present the picture very quickly, and the majority of people would agree if this person is trustworthy or not, which is stunning, of course, but there are two caveats here. First of all, the fact that everybody thought a certain face of a certain person belongs to a person who's not trustworthy doesn't mean that they're correct. Okay? We, again, are very confident in our predictions, but at the same time, we're not necessarily correct with them. So first impressions are not to be relied on in most cases, but nevertheless we rely. So So correctness is one thing that people need to remember, that we're not that accurate in first impression. Second thing is that the speed with which you generate predictions depends on the trait that you're judging. So trustworthiness is the first thing we judge when we see somebody new. Okay, you don't ask yourself as first question, is he good in playing piano or bad in playing piano? Okay, so if I have to ask you if this person is good at playing piano, our arrogant mind will generate a prediction. You would say, no, you just use useless information, but still you will come up with some opinion about how good this person is. I know it's ridiculous, but just like I said on the phone, speaking with somebody who's, I don't have any information, I can still form an opinion about how he looks. So how fast we are at forming a prediction, first impressions, depends on what is the trait that we're judging. And it is indeed, as you allude to, very hard to change a first impression. There's no, as they say, there's no second chance for a first impression. So on the one, and this is another ridiculous aspect of our mind, ridiculous in a good way, and I'll explain why. But here, with interactions with humans, it's not so good. The idea that, on the one hand, we form a first impression extremely quickly, based on very little information, but at the same time, this extremely quick first impression is stubborn, is rigid, and it takes many counterexamples before you change your mind. Okay? And I give an example in the book about you going with somebody to a restaurant for the first time, and then when the bill arrives, when the check arrives, they go to the bathroom and leave you with a check, and you think this person is very cheap, and then 10 next meals this person is going to pay for you, and still you're stuck with this first impression. That said, we do have most other domains, when it's not in interactions with other humans, other domains where relying on our first impression is very important. Let's take again this blurred image of something that looks like a gun, a hairdryer, or a drill. So here, you do want to act on your first impression. There might be a gun there. I should protect myself, okay? Mm-hmm. And if you erred, if you made a mistake and it was a hairdryer, no harm done. But you do want to react as quickly as possible based on this very cursory information. So I believe the system was built like this to save us, so we can react very quickly to things before all the rich details arrive to our cortex, the visual cortex. We can just generate the proper response very quickly. Of course, it transcended also to our interactions with humans, and there it's less desirable how based on very little exposure, little information, we already form an opinion and then stick to it.
Mm-hmm. So earlier I've asked you about human preferences, the relationship between associative thinking and preferences. What about personality? Is there any relationship between the kinds of states of mind we generate and our personality?
Yeah, it's a good question. So on the one hand, we have our own personality, and people have to remember that the issue of personality is something that's a little bit debatable as of recent years, but nevertheless, we all know what we mean when we talk about the personality. So we stick to it. So when we have somebody might be more of a risk taker than somebody else. Somebody else is more considerate and balanced and etc. More creative or less creative. But even within this, I don't want to say determinism, but within this personality of yours that maybe you're born with 100%, still there are fluctuations. And this is the state of mind. It's as if the personality is the envelope, is the limits. Your personal limit and my personal limit is another, and somebody else's personal limit is different. But still we can fluctuate, okay? The same person can be more creative or less creative depending on circumstances. So I can take Ricardo and induce a certain paradigm, have him playing certain games in our lab and make him more creative than usual or less creative than usual. There are ways where state of mind can actually modulate this. So I cannot make you or myself Leonardo da Vinci, but we can make ourselves more or less. So we fluctuate. So state of mind is really the smaller fluctuations within the larger limits, bigger limits of personality.
Mm-hmm. So tell us now, what is immersion?
Immersion is, so I do mention in the book, it's not a book about Buddhism and it's not a book about meditation. I just don't know enough to write a book about this. But I did reach a lot of my observations, and I don't want to say insights necessarily, but thoughts and ideas from my journey into the world of meditation and Buddhism. And again, I'm not an expert, but I am curious and I tried things firsthand. So obviously, when I reached these silence meditations, it was both because of scientific curiosity. I knew that as somebody who studies the mind and studies mind wandering, I need to understand more about this ancient practice that seems to be helpful for many people. So I really came there with a decision of not being a scientist in the retreat and not being critical, but rather immerse myself in it, commit myself and give myself to the experience so that I can learn the most. But also I realized that my mind is awfully drifting and wandering, and I wanted to see how can I understand it better. So there is one state that we are in that is drifting beyond our control. And in mindfulness, specifically in the Vipassana meditation that I was practicing and still like to do this from time to time, you kind of, with this practice, it's not as tedious as it sounds. I learned to gain some control over my thinking process. Of course, you need to be aware of it, you need to be practiced, you need to be somewhat disciplined until it becomes your second nature. But I did have some fortunate incidents of bliss and very pleasurable moments of real mindfulness where flowers look differently and the sun falling on my arm felt differently. And everything is so much better in terms of sensitivity and interaction. So I realized that I'm now aware of everything that's in my environment, much better than before. Before that, I was inside my head and hardly paying attention to anything outside. Now I can see the flowers, I can see the birds, I can also see the bad things. I can see the drill of my dentist approaching my mouth. But all these things are, you just become more aware and more sensitive to your senses. But again, I could not help being a scientist, and when I got home after several experiences such as this, I realized that maybe meditation, with all its benefits, also really teach us to become observers in our own experiences, or witnesses to our own experiences. So now when I'm aware of all the elements in my scene, it's almost like I'm observing myself experiencing, rather than experiencing. So they say, don't be the dancer, be the dance. Okay, so you want to be in your experience. So immersion is a third state that, I started with a very provocative first paragraph in my book with the BDSM and all this, so that to attract people, but to have them understand what is the nature of immersion. So, and the best example really is an extreme example. I can give another example of a roller coaster. So when you're in a very thrilling roller coaster ride, you don't think about the trees that you see on the side and the color of the seats or the wind in your face. You're just completely in this state. You're completely in the roller coaster. There are no thoughts. There are no wanderings. There's zero drifting. You're completely in the experience. So this is immersion. And the idea here is that the more we learn, the more we become aware, the more we practice these ideas that I present in the book, maybe we can make even everyday experiences, such as eating a blueberry and ice cream, be more immersing. So our first ice cream experience exploded our mind. It was so good. But now I can have my ice cream and talk with you and don't even notice that I'm eating an ice cream because I don't pay my mind to it. I don't pay attention to it. So imagine if we could have all, or not all, but many of our everyday experiences be as immersive as a roller coaster ride.
Related to that, do you think that with our modern way of life, and by that I mean the way of life we tend to live in modern industrialized or post-industrial societies, might interfere with our ability to immerse ourselves in meaningful activities?
Yes, it's a good question. I gave recently an interview exactly about how technology influences this and interferes. So Kurt Vonnegut, who I really love his writing, had a short story about a futuristic world where they wanted everybody to feel equal, and if somebody was born very light and athletic and she was a great dancer, they put weights on her ankles, so she cannot jump and cannot be as light. And people that were extremely smart, they put these headphones, and every 2 minutes there's a huge high-frequency sound playing in their ears, so they stop their thoughts and they forgot what was it they were thinking about. They cannot develop deep thoughts. Similarly, I think technology just interferes, period, not only with our ability to be immersed, but also with our ability to complete a thought. So if I speak with you now and my phone keeps buzzing, obviously I cannot complete my thought unless I put it away. And if I have my daughter tells me about her dance rehearsal in school, and I am bothered by all kind of sounds and blips and beeps and all kind of technological alerts, then it takes me away from being immersed and being fully listening to her and being completely also mindful. So it's not only immersion, but also being mindful. Things that take us away from the present. So technology definitely plays a large part in this.
Mm-hmm. So one last question. Are there scientifically validated ways through which we can deliberately change our states of mind?
Yes, so I did list, my editor kind of convinced me to write an appendix at the end of the book with practical suggestions. So as a scientist, I'm kind of shying away from being too concrete. It's really an individual journey for each of us. And I think the biggest thing I can do is to make people aware of these different states of mind, but giving prescriptions is really hard. Nevertheless, we can say general things that can bring people to the right neighborhood. So first of all, realizing that we are changing our mind, changing our state of mind, and it's usually a good thing. So take a unidimensional example, and then we can project it to states of mind. Think about the pupil, right? The pupil in the eye. So the state of the pupil, not state of mind, the state of the pupil changes depending on how much light there is outside, right? It can be smaller when there's a lot of light. So our body is adaptive to the situation around us. So if you are among people in a new city and you are and you have certain goals and the environment has certain demands from you, a certain state of mind is better than another. So there's no good or bad state of mind, but really there is a state of mind that matches the circumstances and the state of mind that doesn't match the circumstances, okay? So we want to minimize the friction between our current state and the demand. So again, if you're in a foreign city and you want to be experiencing novel experiences, you want to not be in an exploitatory state of mind. You don't want to be resorting to things that you're familiar with, but rather willing to take risks in order to learn new things. So we do know that, if you want to be, let's say that you're a boss in some company and you want your workers to come up with great ideas and you want to see them in a room like this and start a brainstorming session for creative ideas. If they come in a bad mood, there's no chance they'll be very creative, okay? So if you take state of mind into account, okay, let's make them be in a better mood, either call them when they're in a better mood, or just induce a better mood. Give them some ice cream, some funny videos on the screen, and now they're all laughing and happy. Now ask them to think creatively about a certain issue. they're more likely to be creative when they're in a happier mood, as we said before. So playing with all these correlations can help you optimize your state to the demands of the environment.
Mm-hmm. Okay, so the book is again Mindwandering, how your constant mental drift can improve your mood and boost your creativity. I will be leaving a link to it in the description box of the interview. Dr. Bar, just before we go, would you like to take the opportunity to tell people where they can find you and your work on the internet?
Yes. Well, I think if they type my name on Google, they find it, but I also have a www.moshebar.org, so there's links to the book, but also to my research and my laboratory. I'm happy to correspond with curious individuals, so I'm trying to be responsive when people email me questions. But I'm also, on Twitter and all these things that people can find me. Thank you very much for this opportunity, Ricardo.
No, thank you very much for your time, and it was really fun to talk to you.
Thanks. Take care.
Hi guys, thank you for watching this interview until the end. To keep the channel sustainable, I would like to ask you to please visit my Patreon page and to consider making a pledge there. Any amount, even $1 per month, would already be a great help. Otherwise, and if you like what I'm doing, please share it, leave a like and hit the subscription button. This show is brought to you by Enlights Learning and Development Done Differently. Check their website at enlights.com. I would also like to give a huge thank you to my main patrons and PayPal supporters, Karen Litske and Blanchett Perga Larsen, Lau Guerrero, Francis Ford, Hans Frederick Sunder, Ricardo Vladimiro, Greg Healy, Adam Castle, Olaf Alec, Jonathan Wissel, Jacob Klinkby, Matthew Whittingbird, Arno Wolfkin, Tim Hollis, Henry Kalenia, John Connors, Paulina Barron, Philip Force Connolly, Jerry Mueller, Herbert Gintis, Bo Weingard, Rebecca Neuberger Goldstein, Dan Demetriou, Robert Windiger, Rui Inácio, Arthur Coe, Zup, Marco Neves, Colin Holbrook, Susan Pinker, Bernardo Seixas, Pablo Santurbano, Simon Colombo, Jorge Spinha, Phil Kavanagh, Corey Clark, Mark Blythe, Roberto Inguanzo, Michael Stormir, Samuel Andreev, Tiago Nunes, Bernard Ugni, Alexander Dunbauer, Fergal Cusson, Evan Bodrenko, Al Herzog, Don Ross, Jonathan Librand, Oslan Bullitt, Nathan Nguyen, Stanton T, Samuel Correa, Eric Hines, Mark Smith, J.W., João Eira, Tom Hummel, David Sloan Wilson, Yacila Dez Araújo, Eden Solon, Romain Roach, Dmitry Grigoriev, Diego Londonio Correa, Tom Roth, Yannick Punter, Adana Rusmani, Charlotte Bliss, Nicole Barbaro, Adam Hunt, Pavel Ostazewski, Nelek Bach, Catherine and Patrick Tobin, Al Ortiz, Guy Madison, Gary G. Hellman, João Linhares, Lida Cosmides, Saima Afzal, Adrian Yegi, Nick Golden, Paulo Tolentino, João Barbosa, Jules Price, Edward Hall, Edin Bronner, Franca Bortolotti, Gabriel Pons Cortez, Ursula Litske, Denise Cook, Scott, Zachary Fish, Tim Duffy, and Max Belby. My producers Izar Webb, Jim Frank, Lucas Staffinia, Ian Gilligan, Luís Caetano, Tom Vanagdam, Curtis Dixon, João Linhares, Benedict Mueller, Vega Guidi, Sardas Francis, Thomas Trumbull, and Nuno Welder. And my executive producers Michel Rugieski, Rosie, James Pratt, Matthew Lavender, Sergio Quadriano, and Bogdan Kanivets. Thank you for all.